Good Sunday morning, brothers and sisters. How can we know if our worship is pleasing to God? One sure way is to carefully avoid what the Bible deems false worship. Number one, worshiping the wrong God. One form of false worship is the worship of false gods. There is no other God but the God of the Bible, and He is a jealous God who will not tolerate the worship of another. In Isaiah 48, verse 11, God says, quote, "My glory will I not give to another." Exodus 34, verse 14 says, quote, "You shall not worship any other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God." Yet most of the world's worship false gods. Romans 1:21 indicts all of mankind for this tendency. Quote, "Even though they knew God," Paul wrote, speaking of the fallen human race, "they did not honor Him as God or give thanks." Paul then outlines the history of our race's descent into deeper and more wicked forms of false worship. It's significant that the very essence of human depravity, as Paul describes it, is bound up in false worship, beginning with the refusal to worship God as we ought. Those who turn away from the true God make their own idols to worship, and that leads to more and more wicked expressions of false religion. Paul sums it up in the fewest possible words, quote, "Professing to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man, and of birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures." Verse 24 then tells the bitter consequence of worshiping false gods. Quote, "Therefore God gave them over in the lusts of their heart to impurity, so that the bodies would be dishonored among them." Verse 26 says, quote, "God gave them over to degrading passions." And verse 28 adds, "God gave them over to a depraved mind." So the result of improper worship is that God simply gives idolaters over to their sin and its consequences. Can you think of anything more worse than that? Their sin increasingly becomes the dominating factor in their lives, and ultimately, as we see in Romans, we learn they face judgment without excuse. We are spiritual creatures, and the drive to worship is one of the most basic human needs God designed in our hearts. Everyone worships. When people reject God, they worship false gods. This is true even of an atheist. He worships himself. That, of course, is what God forbade in the first commandment. False gods may be material objects or mythical beings, among other things. Material gods may be worshipped even without the conscious thought that they are deities. Listen to what it says in Job. "If I have put my confidence in gold and called fine gold my trust, and if I have gloated because my wealth was great, and because my hand had secured so much, if I have looked at the sun when it shone, or the moon going in splendor, and my heart became secretly enticed, and my hand threw a kiss from my mouth, that too would have been in iniquity, calling for judgment, for I would have denied God above." Job refused the inclination to worship his material wealth. If you worship what you possess, if you center your life on yourself, your possessions, or even your needs, you have denied God. You have in effect made your possessions your God. Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 15 through 16 describes the false worship of the Chaldeans. Quote, "The Chaldeans bring all of them the righteous up with a hook, drag them away with their net, and gather them together in their fishing net. Therefore they rejoice and are glad. Therefore they offer a sacrifice to their net and burn incense to their fishing net." Now their net was their military might, and the god they worshipped was armed power, a classic example of the kind of false worship that some nations frequently fall prey to. Others formulate imaginary personal deities as their false gods. That too is unacceptable. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 20 warns that things sacrificed to idols are in actuality offered to demons. Therefore, if men worship false beings, they may actually be worshiping the demons that impersonate those false gods. Now, a second kind of unacceptable worship is the worship of the true God in a wrong form. Exodus 32 records God's response when the Israelites made a golden calf to worship. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, "Go down at once, for your people whom you brought out from the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have quickly turned aside from the way which I commanded them. They have made for themselves a molten calf and worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, 'This is your God, O Israel, who brought you out from the land of Egypt.'" Now notice that they were paying homage with their lips to Yahweh, the one who had delivered them from the Egyptian slavery. They believed they were worshiping the true God, but they had reduced him to an image. Years later, as recorded in the Old Testament, Moses said to the assembled Israelites, quote, "The Lord commanded me at that time to teach you statutes and judgments, that you might perform them in the land where you are going over to possess it. So watch yourselves carefully, since you did not see any form on the day the Lord spoke to you at Horeb from the midst of the fire, so that you do not act corruptly and make a graven image for yourself in the form of any figure, the likeness of male or female, the likeness of any animal that is on the earth, the likeness of any winged bird that flies in the sky, the likeness of anything that creeps on the ground, the likeness of any fish that is in the water below the earth. And beware not to lift up your eye to heaven and see the sun and the moon and the stars, all the host of heaven, and be drawn away, and worship them and serve them, those which the Lord your God has allotted to all the peoples under the whole heaven." Now, in other words, when God revealed himself to the Israelites, he was not embodied in any distinct form. They were manifestations of his glory and power, the pillars of fire and the smoke, the miracles and the glory reflected in the face of Moses, but there was no tangible or visible representation of God. This is true of God throughout the scriptures. Why is that so? Well, because God does not wish to be reduced to any image. If you think of God as an old man with a beard sitting on a throne, that's unacceptable. Idolatry does not begin with a sculptor's hammer, it begins with the mind. When we think of God, what should we visualize? Absolutely nothing. That may be why God is described as light. It is not possible to make a statue of light. No visual conception of God could properly represent his eternal glory. God bless.